y'all, it's Mary, and I'm so excited you're here for this month's topic, which is all about identity. But before we hop into today's episode, we need to be asking the essential question, who am I? This month we'll explore the ins and outs of what makes us us, and I'll help you come back home to your authentic self.
Welcome to the Living Fully Alive podcast with Mary Hyatt, here to help you find your authentic voice, learn how to love yourself, and embrace your life. And now, your host, life and mindset coach, body love advocate, and doTERRA Presidential Diamond, Mary Hyatt.
Hey y'all, welcome to the fourth episode of this month's topic of identity. If you haven't listened to the other episodes on this topic, I encourage you to go back and check them out. It really is a topic that needed multiple episodes to get to the heart of the matter. And turns out, I looked at my calendar and we get a bonus episode next week on this topic. I'll be hanging out with my girl, part-time co-host Lindsley Brooks again, and we're going to round this out. And we will be talking all about imposter syndrome. Y'all, I tell you what, this seems to come up over and over again in my coaching sessions. So make sure to check that out because we're going to be exploring what it's like to feel like a fraud. And of course, the best way to be reminded when an episode comes out is to subscribe to the podcast. So go ahead right now, hit pause, subscribe, and then come back to me, okay? I want to make sure that you don't miss out on any future episodes because I know your true self depends on it. All right, so for today's episode, this will be a little bit more of a conceptual conversation. We can't really get to the practical application of this until we understand the foundation of our identity. I want to explore who is driving the bus of our life. We'll look at which parts of ourselves that is sort of making the decisions and look at how we can come back to the highest, most real version of ourselves so that we can truly live fully alive, aligned with our true selves. And I mean, think about it. Did you know that you had many selves? Anytime I talk about this, all I can think about is the old TV show United States of Terra with Toni Collette. Did y'all ever see that? It's hilarious, but she has something like multiple personality disorder or whatever you would call it. And so she is constantly switching from one personality to the other without any warning. And it creates a wildly dysfunctional family. It's really just a crazy, hilarious show. But I mean, how many of us actually feel like this at times? It's like we have a million voices in our heads, and sometimes we just can't make sense of them all. And oftentimes they are contradicting each other. I mean, I've literally had those moments where I'm talking one part of myself off the cliff by using the wisdom of one of my other selves. I mean, all of this dialogue is happening in my mind simultaneously, and it feels a little crazy. And so how can we begin to make sense of all of this? Whose voice should we be listening to? Whose voice is talking in our mind, really? Which one is the real us? And I believe that we have 4 essential selves, and I'm going to walk you through each of them so that you can begin to recognize sort of what's happening between your ears. And my hope is that with all of this new awareness of your 4 essential selves, you can start walking towards embracing your highest, most authentic self more and more and more and more. And as we continue this conversation on exploring identity, if we aren't working towards sort of coming back home to our highest self, usually it can cause a lot of suffering. Like usually we're in a state of suffering where we're not our true selves. This is when we go on autopilot and we're not aware, or we're operating out of our default. And this is kind of what it looks like. It looks like we believe our thoughts are always true, even if they are lies, even if it's fear, even if it's self-destructive. It looks like we start repeating limiting narratives about who we are. It looks like subscribing to labels and identities that are false, and then also labeling other people. It looks like not healing from our childhood, not doing the work from our childhood, and then we end up going on and repeating it. Like, think about people who, generation after generation sort of pass down these habits and these traits and these behaviors and these addictions and these limited, realities. We end up repeating what we don't heal. We ultimately remain unconscious. We start blaming other people for our life experiences, and we don't recognize, we don't witness, we don't accept the ego, and we start living with attachment and expectations that can cause a lot of resentment. And all of this, when we're not operating from our highest, our true self, this causes suffering. It's damaging, it's hard, it's hurtful to others and to ourselves. We have this longing to be seen. We long to be known for our real selves. And so it starves us from intimacy. But before we get into these 4 essential selves that I know will kind of help you work through this so that you can actually sort of move from a place of this default identity into embracing and accepting and coming home back to your true self, I want to read you this poem. I don't actually often do a lot of poetry. I don't know that I've ever really read a poem on the podcast, but this one was really amazing, and it comes from Charles C. Finn, who, again, I'm not a poetry buff, so I don't even know if that's like somebody who's super famous or not. However, it's really amazing, and I think when you hear it, it's going to be a conversation that I want you to imagine yourself is having with your higher self versus yourself having a conversation with another person. So when this talks about basically needing love from someone, imagine that you're needing that love and having that person fight for you, and that person is actually your higher self. And it's called Please Hear What I'm Not Saying. Don't be fooled by me. Don't be fooled by the face I wear. For I wear a mask, 1,000 masks that I'm afraid to take off, and none of them is me. Pretending is an art that's second nature with me. But don't be fooled. For God's sake, don't be fooled. I give you the impression that I'm secure, that all is sunny and unruffled with me, within as well as without. That confidence is my name and coolness my game. That the water's calm and I'm in command. And that I need no one. But don't believe me. My surface may seem smooth, but my surface is my mask. Ever varying and ever concealing. Beneath lies, no compliance. Beneath lies, confusion and fear and aloneness. But I hide this. I don't want anyone to know it. I panic at the thought of my weakness and fear being exposed. That's why I frantically create a mask to hide behind, a nonchalant, sophisticated facade, to help me pretend, to shield me from the glance that knows. But such a glance is precisely my salvation, my only hope, and I know it. That is, if it's followed by acceptance. If it's followed by love. It's the only thing that can liberate me from myself, from my own self-built prison walls, from the barriers I so painstakingly erect. It's the only thing that will assure me of what I can't assure myself, that I'm really worth something. But I don't tell you this. I don't dare. I'm afraid to. I'm afraid your glance will not be followed by acceptance, will not be followed by love. I'm afraid you'll think less of me, that you'll laugh, and your laugh would kill me. I'm afraid that deep down I'm nothing and I'm just no good, and that you will see this and reject me. So I play my game, my desperate pretending game, with a facade of assurance without and a trembling child within. So begins the glittering but empty parade of masks, and my life becomes a front. I idly chatter to you in the suave tones of surface talk. I tell you everything that's really nothing, and nothing of what's everything. Of what's crying within me, so when I'm going through my routine, do not be fooled by what I'm saying. Please listen carefully and try to hear what I'm not saying, what I'd like to be able to say, what for survival I need to say, but what I can't say. I don't like to hide. I don't like to play superficial, phony games. I want to stop playing them. I want to be genuine and spontaneous and me, but you've got to help me. You've got to hold out your hand, even when that's the last thing I seem to want. Only you can wipe away my eyes. away from my eyes the blank stare of the breathing dead. Only you can call me into aliveness. Each time you're kind and gentle and encouraging, each time you try to understand because you really care, my heart begins to grow wings, very small wings, very feeble wings, but wings. With your power to touch me into feeling, you can breathe life into me. I want you to know that. I want you to know how important you are to me, how you can be a creator, an honest to God creator of the person that is me, if you choose to. You alone can break down the wall behind which I tremble. You alone can remove my mask. You alone can release me from my shadow world of panic and uncertainty from my lonely prison, if you choose to. Please choose to. Do not pass me by. It will not be easy for you. A long conviction of worthlessness builds strong walls. The nearer you approach to me, the blinder I may strike back. It's irrational, but despite what the book says about man, often I am irrational. I fight against the very thing that I cry out for, but I am told that love is stronger than strong walls. And in this lies my hope. Please try to beat down those walls with firm hands, but with gentle hands, for a child is very sensitive. Who am I, you may wonder? I am someone you know very well, for I am every man you meet, and I am every woman you meet. Is that not just so powerful? Like, can you relate to that? I just see this all the time. And what I love about that is that invitation, please break down my walls. Please come to me. Please love me. And what I see there is it's like our little child, which we'll talk about in a minute, is asking for our higher self or our higher power to show us how lovable, how worth it we are. And this is the invitation today to fight for your true self, to fight for your highest self, to fight for the little girl inside of you, the wounded one, the one that has a longing to be seen, the one who is hiding and wearing all the masks, our ego who's trying to earn approval. That ultimately the invitation today is for your soul to fight for you, to invite that in. And so now let's dive into our 4 essential selves, because the goal here is to move from our lower reactive self to our highest real soul self, to be able to name these different selves so that they don't sort of behind the scenes subconsciously control us. So the first essential self is the ego. This is the I in identity. So anything that comes after the word I am, XYZ, I am, is our ego. And sometimes our ego gets a bad rap. And so it's not bad or wrong to have an ego. Every single human being has an ego. But it's important to understand how it operates, because left to its own devices, it does create a lot of suffering. The ego is kind of our concept of self. It's an avatar self created in our psyche to protect our sense of self, our self-esteem. The ego is what we traditionally call our identity. So the ego identifies with our possessions, our titles, our accolades, our physical appearance, our abilities, our education, our family of origin. That is our ego. It's not our essential self. We have an ego, but we are not our ego. Okay, I'm going to say that again because it's really important. We have an ego, but we are not our ego. So Charles Whitfield, this is what he says about our ego or our false self. And he is, oh my gosh, just an amazing author, doctor. He is an MD, and he has written a book called Healing the Child Within. And he does a lot of workshops and lectures, and is just kind of one of the original psychotherapists. And so here's what he says. He says, our ego, it forgets our oneness. It feels separate. It is our public self, who we think others, and eventually even we think we should be. Most of the time, when we are in the role of our false self, we feel uncomfortable, numb, empty, or in a contrived or contracted state. We do not feel real, complete, whole, or sane. At one level or another, we sense that something is wrong and that something is missing. So think about having a soul, an essential self, and then think about all of the masks that are built on top of it. Our ego is what is described through all of those masks. And if we go even further, our ego uses things that we possess to help identify ourselves, our homes, our car, our jewelry, anything that we own. These are just the things that we use to help us communicate to the world more of who we are. It's like saying, okay, this is me. This is me. This is the parts of me. And you can see that through the car that I drive and the clothes that I wear and the things that I value and the books that I buy. That's all an expression of our ego. And, what's interesting is, we've had a whole conversation over the past couple podcast episodes within this month of identity where Lindsley and I talked to Kate Pintor, who was our guest on the last episode. So if you haven't checked out those, make sure you go back and listen. But she talked a lot about personality, our strengths, our talents, what makes us unique, things that can help us identify with ourselves more, like these personality tests, like the Enneagram or Strengths Finder. But this is just an extension of our ego, a way to describe ourselves, an attachment to particular qualities. Now, I'm not saying anything of this, not saying that any of this is bad. I love it. I love that. But the ego can cause a lot of suffering because the ego is very fragile. Think about how many times these things change in our lifetime, like how many times we evolve, we change houses, we change our look, we change our relationships, we change our jobs, we learn new skills, we have new awareness. And the ego is very sensitive. It's sensitive to criticism or being misunderstood. It's drawn to labeling ourselves and others. It's very fear-based. It seeks approval and significance. When our ego is the one that's driving the bus in our decision-making, a person who's operating out of ego is going to feel really insecure. Everything is kind of motivated by this fear that we aren't enough, that we aren't loved. And we're hyper-focused on what other people think. And so when we operate out of ego, we don't take responsibility for our own suffering. The ego always externalizes. It projects. It blames other people and situations. It rationalizes our behavior. And the ego is the part of ourselves that feels rejected, the part of ourselves that feels judged, the part of ourselves that feels victimized, the part of ourselves that feels criticized. Think about that old saying, that bruised my ego. The ego is really sensitive. And the ego also is very attached. It's very attached to people. It's very attached to our job, our intelligence, our possessions. Everything is about image for the ego. Everything is self-serving. Everything is up for negotiation. Everything is in flux. Everything is external. And Eckhart Tolle, who has written a lot about our ego, one of his books, The New Earth, is fabulous. But he says, you don't become good by trying to be good, but by finding the goodness that is already within you and allowing that goodness to emerge. But it can only emerge as something fundamental changes in your state of consciousness. And so the ego is always measuring itself up against other people. It's trying to be good. Like, let's say the ego says something like, I want to be a healthy person. I want to be a healthier person than somebody else that you know. And so the ego kind of has all these ideas of what it should be. It wants to be certain things because it wants to have a better image of itself. The ego has an agenda. It's always seeking. It's always thinking. It needs something. It wants something. It's trying to get a reaction. It's trying to get its needs met. It operates out of good and bad, and it wants to be good. It actually wants to be better, and it actually wants to be the best. So when we have a higher level of thinking and a higher level awareness around this, we can begin to lay down our ego. And in order to do that, we're going to have to get in a neutral state because, again, that ego, it's like everything is good or bad, black and white kind of thinking. It's always self-serving. And so if we can get to a neutral conscious state where there's no good or bad in that sense, I'm not talking about morality here, but an unconditioned self. And that's one of the most powerful things that we can do is operate out of our highest self. And we'll talk about that in a little bit later. But what's powerful is when we can operate from a place of neutrality, and the best way to do that is staying in the present moment. This is where mindfulness is really helpful for the ego, because we can recognize, oh, that's just my ego trying to gain significance. Oh, that's just my ego trying to get approval. I mean, social media is a wonderful example of this. I mean, it is all ego driven, even from the purest sense. Like even when, I think about my account and I try to be really positive and I try to give people, just a reminder of their lovability and all of that. There's still an element of ego involved. But what's amazing is that the present moment is the easiest exit point out of the ego. The ego can't coexist with the present. The ego only lives in the past and in the future. And so when you're present in this moment, there is no past or future. There's only now. And you don't need a self, an ego, a self, to experience this moment. You can just be, being still, observing. That's the opposite of the ego, because the ego is do, earn. And our soul, the present moment, can just be. Be still and know that I am God. Be still. So incredibly powerful. And so our ego's personality has thoughts. It's known through our thoughts. It lives in the past. It lives in the future. It's thought-focused. It identifies with our personal story, our status, our roles, our nationality, our jobs, our things. It's very temporal. It's the doer. It's that mental thought process. It's the reactivity, the suffering. It's separate from others. It's always in a state of comparison. It's living within conflict. Whereas the opposite, our highest self, and we'll talk about this later, that'll be our fourth essential self, it lives in the here and now. It's in the present moment. It's known through presence. It's body-centered. It's transcendent. There is this inner sense of aliveness, infinite depth. It's the observer. It's at peace with it's at peace with all things. It's sort of that oneness, that harmony. And that's how Eckhart Tolle really kind of shows that differentiation between our pure consciousness, our highest self, and our ego personality. And it's important to acknowledge the ego and accept it. It is part of us. We can't get rid of our ego. The more we try to pretend that it doesn't exist, it's interesting. It actually has more hold over us. So when we can call it out, oh, this is just my ego doing its ego thing. It's my ego needing certainty and assurity. When we can call out that our ego is driving the bus, we can take our power back and shift back into our higher self and make decisions that serve our highest good rather than feed into the fear of the ego. So that's our first essential self, is our ego. Hey, y'all, I just wanted to interrupt this episode real quick to remind you to subscribe to this podcast. I know the emails get lost in your spam folder, so subscribing means my episodes come right to your phone. That way you won't miss out on any of the Living Fully Alive episodes. And speaking of episodes, I hope that you're enjoying this month's topic of identity. Turns out there are 5 weeks in this month, so you get one more bonus episode on this topic next week. I thought I would bring my co-host Lindsley Brooks back to talk about what my coaching clients all struggle with: imposter syndrome. We'll explore the ways in which we pretend to have it all together, posture ourselves, and just share the highlight reel of our lives on social media that in the end make us feel like a fraud. You won't want to miss this episode and this candid conversation, so make sure to subscribe and we'll see you next week. All right, now back to this week's episode on our 4 essential selves. Now, the second essential self is our subconscious. Now, my guess is if you follow this podcast and you're doing this self-development work, you've probably done quite a bit of work on your subconscious. This is that below the iceberg part of our brains, the software that is running the show. I mean, sort of 95% of our time is spent here. And these are our core beliefs, our emotions, our memories, our behaviors, our instincts. This is our programmed reaction. This is the script, the tape, the story of what life is. This is typically what ends up driving the bus when we haven't developed our conscious mind. Think about the subconscious mind as the involuntary mind. It's sort of running on autopilot. Its goal is survival. And so it's not going through a rational process to consciously make decisions. Its agenda is to avoid as much pain as possible. This is developed through years of habits, experiences, values, principles, and it organizes itself based on survival. It also controls the body and all of its involuntary actions. It's not logical. It really works on a gut level. And what's interesting about the subconscious mind is that it takes everything as fact. Whatever you say to it, whatever you're repeating, the sentences in your head. If you think about, they say, a person has, 80% or something like that of the same thoughts that they had yesterday. Like our internal dialogue, our subconscious mind is on a loop. It's on a loop and it is going around and around and around and around, and it hits rewind and then it hits play again. And then it hits rewind and it hits play again. And it takes all of that looping, all of those thoughts, all of those sentences, all of those beliefs as fact. It's not working through, is this true? Is this not true? Is this fear? Is this reality? It's just operating as though it is the truest thing in the world. And so you're not consciously dissecting and filtering and sifting through all of these thoughts because it's subconscious. You're not even aware this is happening. It's sort of running behind the scenes. Your subconscious brain can't take a joke. It believes everything you say is truth. And what it ends up doing is it goes into your external world and it's looking for proof that what you're repeating in your subconscious is true in your environment. So if you think on a subconscious level that the world is an unforgiving and frightening place, even if your conscious mind doesn't believe that, but your subconscious mind does, and it's repeating that over and over and over again, then you will find proof of that in your external environment. Your subconscious is your lens on how you see the world. It's your world view. It really is, at the end of the day, how you prioritize, how you judge, how you choose what to value. All of this is based from these core beliefs that you've gathered from your life's experiences in your subconscious. It's that internal programming. And what I love about the subconscious mind, though, is that you actually can reprogram it. If this is what is really running the show, let's have some conscious intention, and control over the software of our operating system. This is where rewriting our story comes in. This is where we release limiting beliefs. This is where we bring in new language. This is where using affirmations, incantations, mantras, meditation, mindfulness, visualization can begin to shift this for us. It is an incredibly responsive system. And it's proven that you can rewire your subconscious brain. I've done it. It's pretty amazing. And I continue to do it because I'm always finding things that are brought into new awareness that I was just operating on autopilot. I'm like, oh, nope, I don't want to believe that anymore. That's not going to give me what I want. And I can rewrite it. I can rewire it. And when you do that, when you create a new operating system with a new set of beliefs, a new set of values, your life is completely different. You make different decisions. You prioritize things differently. You show up in your relationships differently. You relate to your body differently. And I'm not going to go into all the practical methods on how to do that in this episode. Of course, I will be addressing that because that's just a core practice that we'll revisit over and over again in the future. But of course, there's countless books written on this. But let's jump over to our third essential self. And this is one you might not be as familiar with unless you've done a lot of therapy. And this is our essential self of the inner child. I love this so much. I do so much work with my little girl. And this is the child that is still alive within every adult who desperately wants to be seen and heard. This little child carries unhealed, repressed emotions. It's unconsciously seeking love and approval. Typically, our little self is scared to trust or to let go. The irrational part of us that reacts even when our rational brain knows better, that's going to be our little girl or our little boy. It desperately wants to be seen, to be heard, and to know that it's safe and protected. And so when fear creeps up or we get triggered, this is typically what's getting triggered is our inner child. And for those of us who have lived or come from dysfunctional or abusive homes, and let me pause and just say that basically everybody comes from a dysfunctional home. Okay, this is really important. And Charles Whitfield describes a dysfunctional home. He says, it's one in which each member is not getting their needs met, and their psychological and spiritual well-being and growth are not supported by others. So this doesn't mean that it has to be something absolutely horrific or traumatic or horrible. Of course, that would be a dysfunctional family as well, but there is a spectrum. It could be from having a parent who unconsciously tried to mold or shape us from a place of their own undealt with issues. It could come from a parent not allowing us to feel or express certain emotions, like man up, get yourself together. It could come from a parent who puts a lot of pressure on you to perform and to be perfect. It could come from having to be the emotional support of our parents. It could come from a parent who didn't know how to regulate their own emotions, and so we learn how to be caretakers of theirs. It could come from a parent trying to vicariously live through their children. Whatever the cause of the dysfunction, our inner child is typically operating out of a fear of abandonment or fear of being abused in some way. Our inner child is simply trying to get its needs met, but it doesn't have the cognitive and developmental skills to do this in a productive, healthy way. It just knows that A plus B equals C. And so I like to think about my little girl. I like to kind of go back in time and think about, what were her core fears? What needs weren't being met as the middle child of 5 girls, where my family, there was a lot of unintentional neglect based on the number of kids. My dad working several businesses as an entrepreneur, being feast and famine, not having hardly any money. Just a lot going on, and zero judgment, because truly they were doing the best they can. I have so much grace and compassion for them as an adult. But the reality is there were needs in my little girl, and this is really true for all of us, that weren't being met, if we're honest. So what was she trying to get that she wasn't getting? How was she trying to earn love? And for me, I played the part of the middle child, the funny people pleaser, the one that overgave, the one that thought that she had to give a man whatever he wanted in order to be loved. That love was an exchange. I give you what you want, so I get love. And this led me down a road of dating a lot of what I would probably say were mildly sexually and psychologically abusive boys. My little girl didn't know any better. She was just trying to do whatever she could do in order to get love. And of course, I wasn't consciously thinking about any of this. None of us are when we're little. It was what I did that would get me to the quickest kind of hit or dose of love. The seed of addiction, for example, lies in undealt with traumas from our childhood. Mine being the addiction of codependency, But to be honest, any issue we have where we are coping or numbing, when we're stuck in flight or fight response, reaction mode, stems from the wounds of our inner child. When we run and hide, so think about this in your own life. I feel like it shows up a lot in relationships. But when we run and hide, when we avoid confrontation, when we self-sabotage, when we shut down, when we get triggered, when we lash out, when we operate as a people pleaser, when we try to control, when we become obsessive, we try to manipulate, we become aggressive. This is our little girl driving the bus. It is not our highest self. It is our injured, wounded little girl. Our little girl is hurting. And when she is in control, when she is driving the bus, we are anxious, we are afraid, we are angry, we are reactionary. Sometimes when we operate out of our inner child, we can hear ourselves say things like, I know better. Why am I doing this? Or I'm so scared, or I feel crazy, or this doesn't make any sense. My head is telling me one thing and yet I'm doing something else. Our inner child's needs always take over when we aren't conscious that we have an inner child capable of hijacking the situation. Our sweet little selves. Our inner child also makes life decisions to try to please or impress or to get love from a parent. But once we begin to recognize it, to give sort of acknowledgement to this self, it gives us the opportunity to soothe her, to listen to her, and to comfort her. And that's why you always will hear me talking kindly to my little girl. And I use this example all the time in my coaching, my one-on-one coaching clients. I teach people how to talk to that little girl. It's like, sweetie, I hear you. It's like I get triggered by something and I want to run away and hide, or I want to avoid, or I'm in reaction mode, or I start wanting to have a panic attack. In those moments, it's like, oh, sweetie, I hear you. Gosh, I know that you are so scared right now, but I'm right here. I'm not going anywhere. I've got you. You're okay. I see you. I see you. Or when I've dealt with a lot of body image stuff in the past, looking at myself in the mirror in my own eyes, the eyes of my little girl, where there was a time when I was little where I believed that my beauty was my value and I better be beautiful to men in order to receive love. And so I'll look at myself and I'll say, you are already so beautiful. I see you. You don't have to do anything to earn my love. You delight me in 1,000 ways. I see you. That dialogue with your inner child is deep and powerful work, and probably one of the most healing things that you can do. And, I encourage you to seek out a therapist or a coach to do this work with. And, or a workshop. Chances are, if you do work with a therapist, you're going to be doing some inner work. And when you go into that inner child work and you begin to, look at a picture of yourself when you were, let's say, 5 or 7, or, in a moment where there was some abuse that took place, and you deal with some of those unspoken, undealt with traumas, or just validating what you hear and what you see, acknowledging the voice of your inner child, you move out of that reactionary mode. You move out of that fight or flight survival mode. It's really beautiful. And you can soothe that part of yourself. When that voice comes up, when it starts running the show, driving the bus, you can really slow down and soothe that part of yourself, offer understanding and self-compassion. It's really beautiful. Now, the fourth and essential self is our highest self. This is our conscious awareness. This is our authentic self, our real self, beyond any conditioning, analytical mind, and habitual behavior. This is love-based. This is our soul that is labelless, that is the same today as it was when we were a little baby. It is witnessing this human experience. It's kind of above our humanness, our higher self. I like to think of it as sort of like floating above me, of my physical human body. And it's like this higher, wise mind. This is the part that exists after my body goes away. Once we have removed all of the masks and the facades and the superficialities of who we thought we were supposed to be, who we needed to be in order to survive, what remains is our true self, our highest self, the one who knows how worthy and deserving and whole we are. This is our most wise self, the one that doesn't react from triggers. It is the one who is strong and steady, that unconditioned self. It has nothing to prove. It is our essence. It offers only unconditional love, our truest self. When we talk about being authentic, sometimes it's still operating in the ego. But when we talk about our highest selves, this is our truest self. It knows that people's actions or judgments or expectations or criticisms are not a reflection of them. This higher self doesn't feel responsible for other people's emotions. It gives space for everyone to have their process. It's incredibly trusting. And at its core, this highest self knows that it is enough, that it is lovable. And it gives us permission to be human. It takes full responsibility of owning our life. And I love thinking about ourself as little babies, because I think babies are the closest version of this unconditional or unconditioned self. Babies have no ego. Babies haven't really lived in anything, traumas. They aren't self-identified. They don't know their gender. They don't know their name. They don't know if they're American or French or Black or white. They aren't cynical. They don't have any judgments. They aren't comparing themselves to other babies. They're just pure love, sweet little babies. This pure love. Or as St. Francis of Assisi would call, this is our eternal loveliness. And the mantra of our highest self is, I am lovable. And it knows that to be true. It is our most authentic self. It's just so beautiful. And so now that you have this new awareness of our 4 essential selves, I think it's so helpful to understand this foundation of how our minds work. And with this new knowledge, this is going to help us be able to consciously walk towards embracing our highest self. Because when we are operating from that self, we find peace. We aren't trying hard to prove ourselves or to earn love. You're not acting from a place of being on autopilot. You're not letting the wounding of our childhood, our little inner child, dictate how we respond. It allows us to be fully conscious, present, and aware. It's how we begin to take our power back and our true identity, coming into alignment with our true identity. It's so powerful. And so in my own life, when I find myself in a place of being in a place of fear or anxiety, when I'm feeling triggered, when I'm moving into some kind of method of coping, when I'm feeling triggered and I want to avoid or run and hide or fight, when I'm feeling really sensitive and emotional, it's like I can access this highest self and slow down to hear the voice of my highest self. Tapping into what my highest self already knows about me. Hearing what my highest self would remind me of, that I am so lovable just because I breathe. That I am safe. My highest self will always see me, will always hear me, will always offer unconditional love and self-compassion. Always giving me space to work it out. My highest self has no judgments, no criticisms. It knows its worthiness. It knows its enoughness. It knows its value, which has nothing to do with what I come into the world bringing or offering or presenting or giving. That all of that is this deeper knowing that I am enough because I exist. That I'm no more valuable or lovable if I'm creating incredible content and podcasts as when I'm lying on the couch watching Netflix. It is this beautiful conscious awareness. That is a higher mind, kind of seeing above the tree line, the whole story, the bigger story. That all is well, that everything is being orchestrated on my behalf for the highest good of myself and all those involved. That's our highest self. And we have to acknowledge the ego. We have to acknowledge our subconscious mind. We have to acknowledge our inner child. And we can do a lot to soothe or reprogram or to acknowledge those parts of ourselves, because that is part of being human, having those other selves. And yet with the intention of seeing if we can approach that from our highest self, that is what brings the most peace. It's like, deep exhale. Just feels so good. So hopefully you have upped your level of awareness with these selves, and you can start to kind of think about your identity in a new way. And that your truest identity, your real identity, is that highest self. So y'all, until next week when I when I had this great conversation with Lindsley about being an imposter, having imposter syndrome, feeling like a fraud, remember oh my goodness, y'all. Let's try that again. The purpose of life is to be grateful, to be great, and to be full. All right, I'll see y'all next week. Bye. Thanks so much for listening to today's episode. I hope that you got some amazing nuggets to take home and start implementing into your life. And if you're looking for show notes and links, head on over to maryhyatt.com/show. Again, that's maryhyatt.com/show. And if you loved today's episode, why not bring your girlfriends along this journey of becoming fully alive with you? Just give a quick share of this episode to your social channels and enjoy those debriefing convos with your besties. Thanks again, and I can't wait to connect with you next week.